Ghosts of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, explore the greatest clashes of ideals that have defined nations, the brutal crucibles where beliefs are tested not in calm debate, but in the searing crucible of war. These are the conflicts that have carved the very soul of a people, where the abstract notions of freedom, union, and human dignity are paid for in the currency of blood and bone. The American Civil War was such a crucible, a maelstrom of conviction and violence that threatened to tear a nation asunder. And within that war, there was a single day so savage, so utterly saturated with death, that it has been seared into the American consciousness as a day of unparalleled horror, September 17, 1862. This is the story of the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history. This is the story of the ghosts of Antietam. In the late summer of 1862, the Confederacy was ascendant. General Robert E. Lee, at the head of his seemingly invincible Army of Northern Virginia, had driven the Union's massive Army of the Potomac from the gates of Richmond in a series of brilliant and brutal battles. The Union was reeling, its armies demoralized, its leadership in disarray. President Abraham Lincoln, grappling with a war that was spiraling out of control, saw his nation teetering on the brink of collapse. The dream of a perpetual union, a shining beacon of democracy in a world of monarchies, was flickering, threatening to be extinguished by the very people who had once pledged their lives to it. Lee, a master of audacity and a shrewd reader of his opponent's mind, saw an opportunity. He knew that the North was weary of war, that a growing chorus of voices was calling for a negotiated peace, a peace that would mean the permanent division of the United States. He also knew that the European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, were watching the conflict with keen interest. Their textile mills were starved for Southern cotton, and a decisive Confederate victory on Northern soil might be enough to convince them to grant the Confederacy the one thing it desperately needed: official diplomatic recognition. With foreign recognition, trade, aid, and perhaps even military intervention would come. The war would be won. And so, in early September, Lee made his fateful decision. He would cross the Potomac River and take the war into the North. He would invade Maryland, a border state with divided loyalties, a state where he hoped to find fresh recruits and supplies. He would threaten the great northern cities of Baltimore and Philadelphia, and perhaps even the capital itself, Washington, D.C. He would force the timid and overly cautious Union commander, General George B. McClellan, into a decisive battle on ground of his own choosing. It was a gamble of epic proportions, a throw of the dice that could either win the war for the Confederacy or seal its doom. As the ragged but confident soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia, many of them barefoot and clad in tattered butternut and gray, splashed across the Potomac, a wave of panic swept through the North. The war, which for so long had been a distant affair fought on Southern soil, was now at their very doorstep. Church bells rang in alarm, and militias were hastily called up to defend their homes. In Washington, Lincoln turned once again to the man he had twice demoted, the man he privately called a tyrant but publicly hailed as a brilliant organizer, General George B. McClellan. Little Mac, as his adoring soldiers called him, was a master at training and equipping an army, but on the battlefield, he was plagued by a crippling indecisiveness, a tendency to overestimate the enemy's strength and to see phantoms of Confederate armies where none existed. Yet, he was the only man who could restore the shattered morale of the Army of the Potomac. With a heavy heart, Lincoln gave him command once more, telling his cabinet, "We must use the tools we have." McClellan, ever the showman, rode out to meet his adoring troops, who greeted him with wild cheers. He was their savior, the man who would lead them to victory. But as he set his vast army in motion, he moved with his customary caution, his every step dogged by the fear of a trap. He believed Lee's army to be far larger than it actually was, and he refused to be drawn into a battle until he was certain of success. Then, on September 13th, a miracle happened. In a field near the town of Frederick, Maryland, a Union soldier, Private Barton Mitchell of the 27th Indiana, stumbled upon a small package wrapped in a piece of paper. Inside there were 3 cigars, a welcome prize for any soldier. But wrapped around the cigars was a document that would change the course of the war, a copy of Lee's Special Order 191. It was a detailed itinerary of the Confederate invasion, laying out the precise location of every division of Lee's scattered army. The order had been lost, a freak accident of war that had delivered the Confederate battle plan directly into the hands of their enemy. When the order was brought to McClellan, he could scarcely believe his good fortune. "Here is a paper with which if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home," he crowed to his staff. The fog of war had been lifted. He knew where Lee was, he knew where Lee's army was going, and he knew that it was dangerously divided. It was a moment that called for swift, decisive action, for a lightning strike that could destroy the Army of Northern Virginia piece by piece. It was a moment that called for a general unlike George B. McClellan. Instead of launching an immediate attack, McClellan hesitated. He spent precious hours verifying the authenticity of the order, his innate caution battling with the incredible opportunity that had been laid before him. By the time he finally set his army in motion, the element of surprise had been lost. A Southern sympathizer had alerted Lee to the discovery of the lost order, and the Confederate commander, his plans in jeopardy, moved with lightning speed to concentrate his scattered forces. He chose a small town in western Maryland, a town nestled in the rolling hills along a meandering creek, as the place where he would make his stand. The town was called Sharpsburg. The creek was called Antietam. As the two great armies converged on this quiet corner of Maryland, the air grew thick with a palpable tension. The soldiers on both sides, veterans of countless battles, knew that what was coming would be different. The stakes had never been higher. For the Confederates, it was a battle for their nation's survival. For the Union, it was a battle to save the dream of a United States. And for the thousands of men who now stood in the ranks, their faces grim and their hearts heavy, it was a battle for their very lives. The night of September 16th was a night of anxious waiting, a night of whispered prayers and letters written home by the flickering light of a campfire. The stillness was broken only by the occasional crack of a picket rifle, a sharp, lonely sound that seemed to punctuate the heavy silence. As a light rain began to fall, perfuming the air with the scent of crushed corn and damp earth, the men lay down in their ranks, their rifles by their sides, and tried to sleep. But for many, sleep would not come. They knew that with the dawn, the storm would break. They knew that with the dawn, the fields of Antietam would run red with blood. The dawn of September 17, 1862, broke gray and misty over the rolling fields of western Maryland. A damp chill hung in the air, clinging to the uniforms of the waiting soldiers and shrouding the landscape in a ghostly pall. As the first faint light of day began to illuminate the eastern sky, the men of the Union First Corps, under the command of General Joseph Hooker, began to stir. They had spent a restless night in the fields of the Poffenberger farm, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the nervous energy of an army on the eve of battle. Now, with the order to advance, they rose to their feet, their faces a mixture of grim determination and quiet apprehension. Their objective was a small, unassuming Dunker church, a simple whitewashed building that stood on a slight rise to the south. But to get there, they would have to cross a 24-acre field of corn, a field that in a few short hours would become one of the most contested and blood-soaked pieces of ground in American history. As Hooker's men moved forward, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the green of the corn, they were met with a deafening roar. From the woods and fields to the south, the Confederate artillery opened up, their shells screaming through the air and exploding in clouds of smoke and shrapnel. The Union guns answered, and soon the air was filled with the thunderous cacophony of a full-scale artillery duel. The very ground seemed to tremble with the force of the explosions, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Through this storm of iron, the Union infantry advanced. They entered the cornfield, the tall stalks obscuring their view and creating a sense of claustrophobic confusion. They could hear the enemy, but they could not see them. The corn, which had been a source of sustenance for the local farmers, now became a deadly trap, a labyrinth of green and gold that would soon be stained with the blood of thousands. As the Union lines pushed deeper into the corn, they met with a hail of lead. The Confederate infantry, under the command of the legendary General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, rose from their concealed positions and unleashed a devastating volley of rifle fire. The sound was like a giant tearing a sheet of canvas, a sharp, ripping sound that was followed by the sickening thud of bullets hitting flesh. Men fell in droves, their bodies contorting in the agony of their wounds. The cornstalks, which a moment before had stood tall and proud, were now being shredded by the storm of bullets, cut down as if by a giant scythe. A Union soldier would later write, "In the time that I am writing, every stalk of corn in the northern and greater part of the field was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, and the slain lay in rows precisely as they had stood in their ranks a few moments before." The fighting was at close quarters, brutal and savage. Men fought with a primal fury, their faces blackened with gunpowder, their eyes wide with the madness of battle. They clubbed each other with their rifles, stabbed with their bayonets, and fought hand-to-hand in a desperate struggle for survival. The battle for Cornfield became a brutal, seesawing affair. The Union troops would surge forward, their battle cries drowned out by the roar of the guns, only to be driven back by a ferocious Confederate counterattack. The Confederates, in turn, would push the Union lines back, their rebel yells echoing through the smoke-filled air, only to be met with a fresh wave of blue-clad soldiers. The field changed hands no fewer than 6 times in the space of 3 hours. Each time the ground became more littered with the dead and the dying. The wounded lay in heaps, their cries for water and for their mothers lost in the din of battle. The air was filled with the stench of blood and the groans of dying men. As the morning wore on, the fighting in the cornfield reached a fever pitch of intensity. The Union 12th Corps, under the command of General Joseph Mansfield, was thrown into the fray, adding their weight to the Union assault. But the Confederates, though outnumbered, fought with a desperate tenacity, their lines bending but never breaking. The fighting was so intense that one Confederate brigade, the Louisiana Tigers, was virtually annihilated, losing over half of its men in the space of a few minutes. A Union officer, watching the carnage, would later write, "It was never my fortune to witness a more bloody, dismal battlefield." By 8:45 a.m., the fighting in the cornfield had reached a stalemate. Both sides were exhausted, their ranks depleted, their ammunition running low. The field was a scene of utter devastation, a charnel house of shattered bodies and broken dreams. The corn, which had once stood so tall and green, was now a trampled, blood-soaked ruin. The dead lay in grotesque piles, their faces frozen in the agony of their final moments. The wounded, their bodies racked with pain, waited for a delivery that for many would never come. In the space of a few short hours, nearly 10,000 men had fallen in and around the cornfield, a testament to the savage intensity of the fighting. And the day was still young. The bloodiest day in American history had only just begun. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its pale light on the carnage of the cornfield, the focus of the battle began to shift. To the south, in the center of the Confederate line, a sunken farm lane, worn down by years of wagon traffic, offered a natural defensive position. It was here that General D.H. Hill's division of Confederate infantry, some 2,200 men, now waited, their rifles resting on the earthen banks of the lane. They were the last line of defense in the Confederate center, and they knew that if they broke, the entire Army of Northern Virginia could be cut in two. They were determined to hold their ground, no matter the cost. Opposing them was the Union 2nd Corps, under the command of the veteran General Edwin Sumner. Sumner, a crusty old soldier who had been in the Army for over 40 years, was eager to get into the fight. He had seen the carnage in the cornfield and was determined to break the Confederate line. He ordered his men forward, a blue wave of over 5,000 soldiers, their bayonets glistening in the morning sun. They advanced with a grim determination, their battle flags snapping in the breeze. They were confident that they could sweep the Confederates from the field. As the Union lines approached Sunken Road, they met with a storm of lead. The Confederates, concealed in their natural trench, rose up and unleashed a devastating volley of rifle fire. The sound was like a thunderclap, a single, deafening roar that echoed across the battlefield. The front rank of the Union advance seemed to evaporate, melting away under the hail of bullets. Men fell in heaps, their bodies piling up on the fields in front of the lane. The Union lines wavered, but they did not break. They closed ranks, stepped over the bodies of their fallen comrades, and pressed on. For the next 3 hours, the fighting in and around the sunken road was some of the most savage and brutal of the entire war. The Union troops, unable to dislodge the Confederates from their fortified position, were forced to stand in the open fields and trade volleys with the well-protected enemy. It was a slaughterhouse. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the screams of the wounded. The ground was slick with blood. A Union soldier would later write, "We were shooting them down like sheep in a pen." But the Confederates were doing the same to them. The fighting was so intense that the sunken road, which had been a quiet country lane just a few hours before, was now a river of blood. The bodies of the dead and wounded lay in grotesque piles, sometimes 3 or 4 deep. The cries of the wounded were heartrending, a chorus of agony that rose above the din of battle. A Confederate soldier, looking down the lane, would later say, "The dead were piled on top of each other. Blood was running in the road." It was a terrible sight. The Union troops, though taking horrific casualties, continued to press their attack. They tried to flank the Confederate position, to get around the ends of the lane and attack the defenders from the rear. But the Confederates, fighting with desperate courage, held them off. The fighting was at close quarters, a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle for survival. Men fought with a savage fury, their faces contorted with rage and fear. They used their rifles as clubs, their bayonets as daggers. They fought until they were killed or wounded, or until they could fight no more. Finally, after 3 hours of relentless pressure, a mistake by a Confederate officer turned the tide of the battle. Believing that he was about to be flanked, he ordered his men to fall back. The order was misunderstood, and soon the entire Confederate line in the sunken road began to unravel. The Union troops, seeing their opportunity, surged forward with a triumphant roar. They poured over the earthen banks of the lane, their bayonets flashing. The Confederates who were left fought with desperate, last-ditch courage, but they were overwhelmed. The sunken road, which had been a bastion of Confederate resistance, was now a death trap. As the Union troops poured into the lane, they met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The dead and dying lay in a tangled mass, their bodies contorted in the agony of their final moments. The blood flowed in rivulets, pooling in the low spots of the road. The air was thick with the stench of death. A Union officer, looking at the carnage, would later say, "The name of the place was the Sunken Road, but we called it Bloody Lane." The name would stick. For the rest of history, this quiet country lane would be known as Bloody Lane, a testament to the savage intensity of the fighting that had taken place there. In the space of 3 hours, over 5,500 men had fallen in and around Bloody Lane, a staggering number of casualties for such a small piece of ground. The Confederate center had been shattered, and the Army of Northern Virginia was on the brink of collapse. A determined Union push at this point could have ended the battle, and perhaps even the war. But McClellan, ever cautious, refused to commit his reserves. He believed that Lee still had a large, uncommitted force waiting to strike, and he would not risk his army in a final, decisive assault. The opportunity was lost. The battle for Bloody Lane was over, but the bloodiest day in American history was far from finished. While the savage struggle for the sunken road was reaching its bloody climax, another drama was unfolding a mile to the south. Here, the Antietam Creek, a sluggish, meandering stream, flowed between steep, wooded banks. Spanning the creek was a picturesque 3-arch stone bridge, known as the Rohrbach Bridge. It was a vital crossing point, and it was here that General Ambrose Burnside and his Union 9th Corps had been tasked with a critical mission, to cross the creek, turn the Confederate right flank, and cut off Lee's line of retreat to the Potomac. It was a task that should have been relatively simple. Burnside had over 12,000 men under his command. Defending the bridge were a mere 500 Georgians, under the command of the fiery General Robert Toombs. But the terrain was a defender's dream. The Georgians were dug in on the high ground overlooking the bridge, their rifles commanding every approach. The bridge itself was a bottleneck, a narrow funnel that would force the Union troops into a killing zone. For 3 long hours, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., Burnside's corps struggled to take the bridge. The Union general, a man known for his magnificent sideburns but not for his tactical brilliance, seemed paralyzed by indecision. He launched a series of piecemeal attacks, sending his regiments forward one by one, only to see them cut to pieces by the well-entrenched Georgians. The 2nd Maryland Infantry, a regiment of Unionists from a state with divided loyalties, was one of the first to charge. They were met with a hail of lead, and in a matter of minutes, nearly half of the regiment was killed or wounded. The 51st Pennsylvania and the 51st New York were sent in next, and they too were repulsed with heavy losses. The creek ran red with the blood of the fallen, and the bridge became a death trap. The fighting was a frustrating and bloody affair for the Union troops. They were so close to their objective, yet they could not take it. The Georgians, though vastly outnumbered, fought with a stubborn courage, their rifles pouring a relentless fire into the ranks of the attacking Federals. The air was thick with the smoke of battle, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the valley. A Union soldier would later write, "We were not fighting, but being slaughtered." Finally, after hours of fruitless assaults, a Union officer found a ford a short distance downstream. A detachment of Union troops was sent across, and they were able to get on the flank of the Georgian defenders. At the same time, the 51st Pennsylvania and the 51st New York, their ranks thinned but their spirits unbroken, launched one final, desperate charge at the bridge. This time, they would not be denied. They stormed across the bridge, their bayonets flashing, and drove the Georgians from their positions. The bridge was finally taken, but at a terrible cost. Over 500 Union soldiers had been killed or wounded in the struggle for the bridge, a bridge that would forever after be known by the name of the general who had so ineptly commanded the assault, Burnside's Bridge. But the day was not yet won. Burnside, ever cautious, spent another 2 precious hours reorganizing his corps and resupplying them with ammunition. It was a delay that would have had fatal consequences. By the time he finally set his men in motion for the final assault on the Confederate right flank, it was late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip towards the western horizon, and the shadows were lengthening across the battlefield. As the 8,000 men of the 9th Corps advanced towards the town of Sharpsburg, they were confident that they were on the verge of a great victory. They could see the spires of the town's churches, and they could hear the Confederate army in disarray. The end of the battle, and perhaps the end of the war, seemed within their grasp. But as they pushed forward, their lines stretching for over a mile, they were met with a sudden and unexpected counterattack. From the south, a fresh Confederate division, under the command of General A.P. Hill, slammed into the Union flank. Hill's men, known as the Light Division, had marched 17 miles in 8 hours from Harper's Ferry, where they had just accepted the surrender of the Union garrison. They arrived on the battlefield at the last possible moment, a deus ex machina of the Confederacy. They were exhausted, their uniforms caked with dust and sweat, but they were ready to fight. With a blood-curdling rebel yell, Hill's men crashed into the unsuspecting Union flank. The Union lines, which had been so confident just a few moments before, now buckled and broke. The attack was a complete surprise, and it threw the Union left into a state of chaos. Regiments were shattered, their men fleeing in panic back towards the Antietam Creek. The momentum of the Union assault was broken, and the tide of the battle, which had seemed to be flowing so strongly in the Union's favor, now turned once again. The fighting on the southern end of the field was a confusing and desperate affair. The Union troops, caught off guard and disorganized, fought in small, isolated pockets, their officers struggling to restore order. The Confederates, sensing victory, pressed their attack with a renewed fury. The sun was setting, and the battlefield was shrouded in a deepening twilight. The battle smoke hung heavily in the air, and the flashes of the rifles illuminated the gruesome scenes of carnage. The cries of the wounded and the dying filled the air, a final, terrible chorus to the bloodiest day in American history. As darkness fell, the fighting sputtered to a close. The Union Ninth Corps had been driven back to heights overlooking the Antietam Creek, their dreams of a decisive victory shattered. The Confederates, though exhausted and battered, had held their ground. The Battle of Antietam was over. For 12 long hours, from the misty dawn to the bloody twilight, the two armies had grappled with each other in a death struggle of epic proportions. They had fought in the Cornfield, in the West Woods, in the Bloody Lane, and at Burnside's Bridge. They had fought with courage and savagery that had rarely been seen before in the annals of warfare. And now, as the stars began to appear in the night sky, the battlefield fell silent, a silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the rustle of the wind in the trees. The cost of the battle was staggering. In a single day, on a field of battle that was no more than a few square miles, nearly 23,000 men had been killed, wounded, or were missing. It was a number that was almost impossible to comprehend, a number that was greater than all the American casualties in all the previous wars of the nation's history combined. The fields of Antietam were a vision of hell, a landscape of death and destruction that would haunt the memories of those who had witnessed it for the rest of their lives. The dead lay in heaps, their bodies contorted in the agony of their final moments. The wounded, their bodies shattered and their spirits broken, lay in the fields and in the makeshift hospitals, their cries for help a constant, heart-rending refrain. The surgeons, their arms covered in blood, worked through the night, their saws and knives a grim counterpoint to the silence of the battlefield. The night of September 17th was a night of unimaginable suffering, a night of quiet reflection, a night of ghosts. The night of September 17th descended upon the fields of Sharpsburg not with the gentle peace of a rural evening, but with a profound and heavy silence, a silence that seemed to absorb the echoes of the day's terrible symphony. The guns had fallen quietly, but the war was far from over. For the thousands of wounded men who lay scattered across the landscape, a new and private battle had just begun, a battle against pain, against shock, against the creeping cold of death. The battlefield, shrouded in darkness and illuminated only by the faint, flickering light of a sliver of moon and the bobbing lanterns of search parties, was a landscape transformed into a vision from Dante's Inferno. The familiar fields of corn and clover, the quiet woods and gentle slopes, were now a charnel house. The dead lay where they had fallen, their bodies twisted into unnatural poses, their faces pale and waxen in the moonlight. They lay in rows, in heaps, in lonely isolation, a silent testament to the day's savage fury. A Union soldier, walking the field that night, would later recall, the dead were so thick in places that you could have walked on their bodies without touching the ground. But it was the living who suffered most. The cries of the wounded filled the night air, a constant, agonizing chorus that rose and fell with the shifting breeze. There were cries for water, for help, for mothers and wives and sweethearts. There were the low moans of men in deep and unrelenting pain, the sharp screams of those whose shattered limbs were being probed by a surgeon's instrument, and the quiet, desperate whimpers of those who knew that their lives were ebbing away. For the men who had survived the battle unscathed, the sounds of that night would be etched into their memories forever, a soundtrack of suffering that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Throughout the night, the work of the surgeons and the ambulance corps went on. They moved through the fields like specters, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows on the gruesome scenes around them. They searched for signs of life among the heaps of the dead, their hands gently probing for a pulse, their ears listening for the faint sound of a breath. When they found a man still alive, they would lift him gently onto a stretcher and carry him to one of the makeshift field hospitals that had been set up in the farmhouses, barns, and churches of Sharpsburg. These places, which had once been centers of life and community, were now transformed into factories of pain and death. The floors were slick with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of chloroform and human suffering. The surgeons, their arms bare and their aprons stained with blood, worked with a grim and tireless efficiency. They had no time for sentiment, no time for gentle bedside manners. They were engaged in a desperate race against time, a race to save as many lives as they could. Their primary tool was the saw, and the sound of bone being severed was a constant, sickening counterpoint to the groans of the wounded. Piles of amputated limbs grew outside the hospital doors, a gruesome testament to the day's butchery. For the soldiers who lay in the ranks, their rifles by their sides, the night was a time of profound and unsettling reflection. They had survived the bloodiest day in their nation's history, but they were not the same men who had greeted the dawn with a mixture of fear and bravado. They had seen things that no man should ever have to see. They had witnessed the fragility of life, the ease with which a man could be transformed from a living, breathing being into a lifeless piece of meat. They had seen their friends and comrades, men they had shared a campfire with just the night before, cut down in an instant. The experience had left them numb, their emotions blunted by the sheer scale of the carnage. A Confederate soldier, writing in his diary that night, summed up the feelings of many. "I have seen more than I ever expected to see. I lay on the field in front of the enemy, where the dead and wounded were laying in heaps around us. I can't realize it at all." As the night wore on, a cold, drizzling rain began to fall, adding to the misery of the wounded and the discomfort of the living. The rain washed the blood from the leaves of the corn and the grass of the fields, but it could not wash away the stain of the day's events. The Battle of Antietam was over, but its ghosts were just beginning to stir. They were the ghosts of the 23,000 men who had been killed, wounded, or gone missing on that terrible day. They were the ghosts of a nation that had been torn apart by its own internal contradictions. And they were the ghosts that would haunt the American psyche for generations to come, a constant and painful reminder of the terrible cost of war. The morning of September 18th dawned on a scene of utter devastation. The two armies, battered and exhausted, still faced each other across the bloody fields of Antietam. But the fire had gone out of them. The savage intensity of the previous day had been replaced by a sullen and weary truce. The soldiers on both sides, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow, stared at each other across the no-man's land of the battlefield, a landscape littered with the grim refuse of war. The air was still thick with the smell of death, a sweet, cloying odor that clung to the back of the throat and turned the stomach. The only sounds were the groans of the wounded, and the sharp, metallic clang of shovels as burial details began their grim work. For General George B. McClellan, the morning of the 18th presented a golden opportunity. Lee's army was shattered, its ranks depleted, its morale shaken. The Army of Northern Virginia was trapped, its back to the Potomac River, with only a single ford to serve as an escape route. A determined Union assault on this day could have destroyed Lee's army and brought the war to a swift and decisive conclusion. McClellan had fresh troops at his disposal, two entire corps that had not been engaged in the previous day's fighting. His subordinates urged him to attack, to deliver the final, crushing blow. But McClellan, true to his nature, hesitated. He was convinced that Lee had a vast, hidden reserve, that the wily Confederate commander was luring him into a trap. He spent the day in a state of indecision, writing his lines, consulting with his generals, and sending out reconnaissance parties. He would not risk his army, he would not risk a defeat. And so, the opportunity was lost. Lee, a man who understood the psychology of his opponent better than anyone, used McClellan's hesitation to his advantage. He put on a bold front, his artillery occasionally lobbing a shell into the Union lines to create the illusion of strength. But all the while, he was preparing for a daring escape. Under the cover of darkness on the night of the 18th, the Army of Northern Virginia began its retreat. The movement was a masterpiece of logistics and deception. The wagon wheels were muffled, the orders were given in whispers, and the campfires were left burning to deceive the Union pickets. By the morning of the 19th, the Confederate army was gone. They had slipped across the Potomac and back into the relative safety of Virginia. McClellan, when he finally realized what had happened, was furious. He had been outwitted once again. He had let the prize slip through his fingers. In Washington, President Lincoln was both relieved and frustrated. He was relieved that Lee's invasion had been turned back, that the threat to the north had been averted. But he was frustrated by McClellan's failure to destroy the Confederate army. "He has got the slows," Lincoln lamented to his private secretary. The president had been waiting for a decisive victory, a victory that would give him the political capital he needed to issue a proclamation that he had been contemplating for months, a proclamation that would change the very nature of the war. Antietam, though not the crushing victory he had hoped for, would have to suffice. On September 22, 1862, just 5 days after the battle, Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was a document that would transform the Civil War from a struggle to preserve the Union into a revolutionary war for freedom. The proclamation declared that on January 1, 1863, all slaves in the states that were still in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward, and forever free. It was a bold and audacious move, a move that was fraught with political risk. It was also a move that was made possible by the sacrifice of the men who had fought and died at Antietam. The Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point in the war, and in the history of the United States. It redefined the goals of the Union war effort, giving it a moral purpose that it had previously lacked. It also had a profound impact on the international situation. Great Britain and France, which had been on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy, now backed away. They could not be seen to be supporting a slaveholding nation that was fighting to preserve the institution of human bondage. The Emancipation Proclamation, in effect, ended the threat of foreign intervention in the war. But the proclamation did not end the war. The fighting would go on for another 2.5 years, and many more thousands would die before the final victory was won. But Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation had changed the equation. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a war to create a new Union, a Union without slavery, a Union that would be, in the words of Lincoln, a new birth of freedom. The legacy of Antietam is a complex and multifaceted one. It was a battle that was, in many ways, a tactical draw. But it was a strategic victory for the Union, a victory that had profound and far-reaching consequences. It was a battle that was fought with savagery and courage that has rarely been equaled. And it was a battle that left a deep and lasting scar on the American psyche. The fields of Antietam are now a national park, a place of quiet reflection and solemn remembrance. The corn still grows in the fields, the trees still stand in the woods, and the creek still flows under the stone bridge. But the ghosts of Antietam are still there. They are in the whispers of the wind, in the rustle of the leaves, in the silent testimony of the monuments that dot the landscape. They are the ghosts of the men who fought and died there, the men who gave their lives for a cause they believed in. They are the ghosts of a nation that was forged in the crucible of war, a nation that is still grappling with the legacy of that terrible conflict. To walk the fields of Antietam today is to walk on hallowed ground. It is to be reminded of the terrible cost of war, of the fragility of life, of the enduring power of the human spirit. It is to be reminded of the words of a Union soldier who, after the battle, wrote, "In the great book of the future, it will be written that the Battle of Antietam was the turning point of the war." And so it was. It was the day the war turned. It was the day the tide began to shift. It was the day that the ghosts of Antietam were born. If this story has awakened something in you, if it has resonated with the truth in your own heart, then our journey together has just begun. Subscribe to this channel. Among the first to feel the fury of the Confederate onslaught in the Cornfield were the men of the Iron Brigade. They were a unit unlike any other in the Union Army, a brigade of Westerners from Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan, known for their distinctive black hardy hats and their fierce fighting reputation. They had earned their nickname, the Iron Brigade, at the Battle of South Mountain just a few days before, when General McClellan himself, seeing them stand firm against a determined Confederate assault, had exclaimed, "Those men are made of iron." Now, in the misty dawn of Antietam, their mettle would be tested as never before. As they advanced into the cornfield, the men of the Iron Brigade were met with a storm of lead that seemed to come from all directions. The Confederates, hidden in the woods and along the Hagerstown Turnpike, poured a devastating fire into their ranks. The corn, which stood over 6 feet tall in places, offered little protection. The stalks were shredded by the hail of bullets, and the air was filled with the sickening thud of lead hitting flesh. Men fell by the score, their black hats making them easy targets for the Confederate sharpshooters. The brigade's commander, General John Gibbon, a tough, no-nonsense regular army officer, rode among his men, his voice a steady presence in the chaos of battle. "Steady, men, steady," he shouted. "Give them hell." The Iron Brigade advanced with a grim determination, their lines dressing to the colors as if on parade. They were a disciplined and well-drilled unit, and their training now paid off. They returned the Confederate fire with a steady and accurate volley of their own, their rifles cracking in the morning air. The fight was at close quarters, a brutal, face-to-face struggle for survival. The men of the Iron Brigade fought with a cold and deadly fury, their bayonets flashing in the dim light of the cornfield. They pushed the Confederates back, driving them from the woods and across the turnpike. But the cost was terrible. In the space of a few minutes, the Iron Brigade lost over a third of its men, a staggering number of casualties that would have broken a lesser unit. One of the regiments in the Iron Brigade was the 2nd Wisconsin, a unit of tough lumberjacks and farmers who had earned a reputation for their hard fighting. As they advanced into Cornfield, they were met with a particularly galling fire from a Confederate battery that was positioned on a slight rise to their front. The commander of the 2nd Wisconsin, Colonel Lucius Fairchild, a man who would later become the governor of his state, knew that he had to take that battery. He turned to his men and shouted, "Boys, we must have those guns." With a wild cheer, the men of the 2nd Wisconsin surged forward, their bayonets leveled. They charged through the hail of canister and rifle fire, their eyes fixed on the prize. They swarmed over the guns, bayoneting the gunners and driving off the supporting infantry. It was a moment of supreme and savage courage, a moment that would be remembered as one of the great changes of the Civil War. But the victory was short-lived. The Confederates, reinforced and regrouped, launched a ferocious counterattack. The men of the 2nd Wisconsin, their ranks thinned and their ammunition running low, were forced to fall back. They retreated through the cornfield, the ground now littered with the bodies of their fallen comrades. They had taken the guns, but they could not hold them. The battle for the cornfield would rage on, a brutal and bloody stalemate that would consume the lives of thousands more before the morning was over. Another unit that distinguished itself in the fighting in the cornfield was the 12th Massachusetts, a regiment of city boys from Boston who were known as the Webster Regiment in honor of the great orator Daniel Webster. They were a proud and well-drilled unit, but they had never seen combat before. Antietam would be their baptism of fire, and it would be a terrible one. As they advanced into the cornfield, they were met with a storm of fire that was so intense that it seemed to be coming from the very gates of hell. The regiment's commander, Colonel Fletcher Webster, the son of Daniel Webster, was killed instantly, a bullet through his heart. The regiment, now leaderless and in a state of confusion, began to waver. But then, a young major named Elisha Burbank took command. He rallied the men, his voice a beacon of calm in the chaos of battle. "Stand fast, men of Massachusetts," he shouted. "For the honor of the old Bay State, stand fast." The men of the 12th Massachusetts, inspired by their young commander, stood their ground. They traded volleys with the Confederates, their rifles growing hot in their hands. They fought with courage and a tenacity that belied their inexperience. But they were being cut to pieces. In the space of a few minutes, the regiment lost over 2/3 of its men, the highest percentage of casualties of any Union regiment at Antietam. Major Burbank was mortally wounded, and the regiment was forced to fall back. They had held their ground, but at a terrible cost. The 12th Massachusetts had entered the battle with over 300 men. They would leave it with less than 100. The survivors, their faces blackened with gunpowder and their hearts heavy with grief, would never forget the day they had fought in the bloody Cornfield. The fighting in the Cornfield was a microcosm of the Battle of Antietam as a whole. It was a battle of incredible courage and savage brutality, a battle of missed opportunities and tragic mistakes. It was a battle that was fought by ordinary men who were called upon to do extraordinary things. They were farmers and shopkeepers, lawyers and laborers, men from all walks of life who had been brought together by the currents of history to fight and die on a quiet field in western Maryland. They were the men of the Iron Brigade and the 12th Massachusetts, the men of the Union and the Confederacy. They were the ghosts of Antietam. From the Confederate perspective, the morning fight for the Cornfield was a desperate and chaotic struggle for survival. General Stonewall Jackson, the brilliant and eccentric Confederate commander, had positioned his men along the Hagerstown Turnpike and in the woods to the west of the Cornfield. He knew that he was outnumbered, but he was confident in the fighting ability of his men. They were veterans of many battles, and they had deep and abiding faith in their commander. As the Union First Corps began its advance, Jackson's men waited with a grim and quiet determination. They held their fire until the Union lines were within close range, and then they unleashed a devastating volley that staggered the attacking Federals. The fighting was particularly intense for the men of General John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade. They were a unit of fierce and hard-bitten fighters, known for their reckless courage and their distinctive Lone Star battle flag. They had been held in reserve in the West Woods, and they had just finished cooking their first hot meal in days when the order came to advance. They moved forward with a wild rebel yell, their blood up, and slammed into the flank of the advancing Union lines. The fighting was at close quarters, a brutal and savage affair. The Texans fought with a desperate fury, their rifles and bayonets taking a terrible toll on the Union ranks. They drove the Federals back through Cornfield, their momentum carrying them all the way to the northern edge of the field. But their success came at a terrible price. In the space of a few minutes, the Texas Brigade lost over 60% of its men, a staggering number of casualties that left the unit shattered and broken. One of the regiments in the Texas Brigade was the 1st Texas, a unit of tough and rugged frontiersmen who were known for their skill with a rifle. As they advanced into Cornfield, they were met with a storm of fire that was so intense that it seemed to be coming from all directions at once. The regiment's commander, Colonel William T. Wofford, was wounded, and the unit began to waver. But then, a young lieutenant named William H. Howdy Martin took command. He rallied the men, his voice a beacon of calm in the chaos of battle. "Up, men, and to your posts," he shouted. "Don't forget that you are from Texas." The men of the 1st Texas, inspired by their young commander, stood their ground. They traded volleys with the Federals, their rifles growing hot in their hands. They fought with courage and a tenacity that was born of desperation. But they were being cut to pieces. When the fighting was over, the 1st Texas had lost over 82% of its men, the highest percentage of casualties of any regiment, Union or Confederate, in the entire Civil War. The fighting in the Cornfield was a brutal and bloody affair for both sides. It was a battle of attrition, a battle in which the only victor was death. By the time the fighting subsided in the late morning, Cornfield was a scene of utter devastation. The dead and the dying lay in heaps, their blue and gray uniforms mingling in a final, tragic embrace. The ground was littered with the grim refuse of war, shattered rifles, broken bayonets, empty cartridge boxes, and the tattered remnants of battle flags. The air was thick with the smell of blood and the groans of the wounded. The battle for Cornfield was over, but the memory of that terrible morning would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. It was a morning that had taught them the true meaning of war, a morning that had stripped away all the glory and the romance, leaving only the stark and brutal reality of death. As the battle for the sunken road raged, and the fields in front of the Confederate position became a carpet of blue-clad bodies, a new sound was heard above the din of battle. It was the sound of a wild, defiant cheer, a sound that was both a prayer and a curse, a sound that would become legendary in the annals of the American Civil War. It was the sound of the Irish Brigade going into battle. The Irish Brigade was a unit of fierce and hard-fighting Irishmen, many of them recent immigrants who had fled the poverty and oppression of their homeland. They were a proud and boisterous lot, known for their love of a good fight and their deep and abiding hatred of the English. They had been recruited in the cities of the Northeast, and they had brought with them all the passion and the fire of their Celtic heritage. Their commander was General Thomas Francis Marr, a fiery Irish nationalist who had been exiled from his homeland for his revolutionary activities. He was a man who understood the soul of his men, and he knew how to lead them. Before the battle, as the brigade was being issued its green battle flags, Marr had addressed his men. "Boys," he had said, "I have only one thing to say to you. When you go into battle, remember Ireland and her wrongs." Now, as they advanced towards the sunken road, the men of the Irish Brigade were in their element. They moved forward with a steady and determined tread, their green flags snapping in the breeze. At their head was their chaplain, Father William Corby, who rode a large black horse and carried a crucifix in his hand. As the brigade came under fire, Father Corby raised the crucifix and shouted, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, I absolve you from your sins. Now, go in and fight like hell." With a wild cheer, the Irish Brigade surged forward. They were a magnificent sight, their green flags a stark contrast to the blue of their uniforms and the red of the blood that was already beginning to stain the field. They advanced with a reckless courage, their officers leading from the front, their ranks closing up as men fell. They were met with a storm of fire from the Confederate defenders in the sunken road, a storm that was so intense that it seemed to be coming from the very bowels of the earth. But the Irishmen did not waver. They pressed on, their bayonets leveled, their eyes fixed on the prize. One of the regiments in the Irish Brigade was the 69th New York, a unit of tough and brawling Irishmen from the streets of New York City. They were known as the Fighting 69th, and they had a reputation for being some of the hardest fighters in the Union Army. As they advanced towards the sunken road, they were met with a particularly galling fire from a Confederate regiment from North Carolina. Two regiments, Irish immigrants and Southern farmers, faced each other, exchanging volleys at under 50 yards. It was a brutal and savage affair, a contest of wills that would be decided by which side could stand the punishment the longest. The men of the 69th New York fought with a desperate fury, their rifles growing hot in their hands. They loaded and fired with mechanical precision, their faces blackened with gunpowder, their eyes burning with the intensity of battle. They shouted insults at the enemy, their Irish brogues a strange and incongruous sound on a battlefield in rural Maryland. They fought for their new country, for their families, for the honor of their regiment, and for the memory of their oppressed homeland. They fought until their ammunition was gone, until their rifles were too hot to hold, until their ranks were so thinned that they could no longer hold their position. When the fighting was over, the 69th New York had lost over 60% of its men, a staggering number of casualties that left the regiment shattered and broken. But they had held their ground. They had not yielded an inch. They had fought like the Fighting 69th. The charge of the Irish Brigade at the Bloody Lane was a moment of supreme and tragic courage. It was a moment that captured the essence of the Civil War, a war that was fought with a passion and a fury that has rarely been seen before or since. The Irishmen of the 69th New York and the other regiments of the brigade had come to America to find a new life, a life of freedom and opportunity. They had not come to fight and die on a quiet field in western Maryland. But when the call came, they answered it. They had fought and died for a country that was not yet fully their own, for a cause that they had made their own. They were the ghosts of Antietam, the ghosts of a generation of Irishmen who had given their lives for the dream of a new and better world. While the soldiers of the two great armies were locked in a death struggle on the fields of Antietam, the civilians of Sharpsburg were caught in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The town, a quiet and peaceful farming community of some 1,300 people, had been transformed overnight into the epicenter of a maelstrom. The thunder of the guns, the whistle of the shells, and the rattle of musketry were the soundtrack to their terror. They huddled in their cellars, their hearts pounding with every explosion, their prayers lost in the din of battle. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, and the very ground seemed to tremble with the force of the concussions. For the people of Sharpsburg, the Battle of Antietam was not a distant and abstract event. It was a terrifying and immediate reality, a reality that was unfolding in their backyards, in their streets, and in their homes. As the battle raged, the town itself became a target. Union artillery, positioned on the high ground to the east of the Antietam Creek, began to shell the town, hoping to dislodge the Confederate sharpshooters who were firing from the windows of the houses. The shells crashed through the roofs of the houses, sending splinters of wood and plaster flying. Fires broke out, and the smoke from the burning buildings mingled with the smoke of battle, creating a thick and choking haze. The civilians, trapped in their cellars, could hear the sounds of their homes being destroyed above them. They could hear the crash of falling timbers, the shatter of breaking glass, and the roar of the flames. They could only pray that their own homes would be spared, that they would not be buried alive in the rubble. One of the civilians who was caught in the terror of that day was a young woman named Mary Bettinger Mitchell. She was a resident of Shepherdstown, a town on the Virginia side of the Potomac River, but she had come to Sharpsburg to visit her sister. When the battle began, she found herself trapped in the town, a helpless witness to the carnage. She spent the day in the cellar of her sister's house, listening to the sounds of the battle and praying for it to end. In her diary, she would later write, "The whole world seemed to be coming to an end. The earth was shaking, the air was filled with the most terrible noises, and the smoke was so thick that we could not see our hands in front of our faces." When the battle was over, and the guns had fallen silent, the people of Sharpsburg emerged from their cellars to a scene of utter devastation. Their town was in ruins. The houses were pockmarked with bullet holes, the roofs were caved in, and the streets were littered with the debris of war. But the destruction of their homes was not the worst of it. The worst of it was the dead and the wounded. The fields and the woods around the town were a carpet of blue and gray, a gruesome harvest of death. The wounded lay in the streets, in the yards, and in the houses, their cries for help a constant and heartrending refrain. The people of Sharpsburg, though they had suffered greatly themselves, now opened their hearts and their homes to the wounded. They turned their houses into hospitals, their sheets into bandages, and their kitchens into soup kitchens. They worked tirelessly, day and night, to care for the men who had been shattered by the storm of war. For the next several weeks, the town of Sharpsburg was one vast hospital. The wounded were everywhere, in churches, in the schools, in the barns, and in every private home. The surgeons, their numbers woefully inadequate for the task at hand, worked with a grim and tireless efficiency. They performed amputations on kitchen tables, with little or no anesthesia. The screams of the wounded were a constant and terrible sound, a sound that would haunt the memories of the people of Sharpsburg for the rest of their lives. The dead were buried in long, shallow trenches, their graves marked only by a simple wooden board. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, a constant and nauseating reminder of the battle that had been fought there. The Battle of Antietam was a transformative event for the people of Sharpsburg. It had shattered their quiet and peaceful world, and it had left them with a legacy of pain and suffering that would endure for generations. But it had also revealed the best of their human nature. In the face of unimaginable horror, they had responded with courage, with compassion, and with a deep and abiding sense of their common humanity. They had seen the face of war, and they had not been found wanting. They were the unsung heroes of Antietam, the civilians who had been caught in the crossfire, the men and women who had endured the unendurable. They were the other ghosts of Antietam. The political and strategic consequences of the Battle of Antietam were profound and far-reaching, consequences that would reverberate through the halls of power in Washington, Richmond, London, and Paris. For President Abraham Lincoln, the battle was a gift, albeit a bloody and imperfect one. He had been waiting for a victory, any victory that would give him the political capital he needed to issue his Emancipation Proclamation. The Union Army had been suffering a series of humiliating defeats, and the Northern public was growing weary of the war. The Peace Democrats, a faction within Lincoln's own party that was calling for a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy, were gaining strength. The midterm elections were looming, and Lincoln feared that if the war continued to go badly, the Democrats would take control of Congress and force him to the negotiating table. Antietam, though not the decisive victory he had hoped for, was enough. Lee's invasion had been turned back, and the Confederate Army had been forced to retreat. It was a victory, and Lincoln would make the most of it. On September 22, 1862, just 5 days after the battle, Lincoln called a special meeting of his cabinet. He had not told them what the meeting was about, and they arrived at the White House with a sense of curiosity and apprehension. When they were all assembled, Lincoln pulled out a document from his desk and began to read. It was the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a document that would change the course of the war and the course of American history. The proclamation declared that on January 1, 1863, all slaves in the states that were still in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward, and forever free. It was a bold and audacious move, a move that was fraught with political risk. Some members of the cabinet were enthusiastic, others were skeptical, and still others were openly hostile. But Lincoln had made up his mind. He had been contemplating this move for months, and now, with the victory at Antietam, he had the political cover he needed to act. The Emancipation Proclamation was a masterpiece of political calculation. It was carefully crafted to achieve several objectives at once. First, it redefined the goals of the Union war effort, giving it a moral purpose that it had previously lacked. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a war to end slavery, a war to create a new Union, a Union without the stain of human bondage. This gave the war a moral clarity that resonated with many in the North, particularly with the abolitionists who had been calling for an end to slavery for decades. Second, the proclamation was designed to weaken the Confederacy from within. By declaring that slaves in the rebel states were free, Lincoln was in effect encouraging them to flee their masters and seek refuge with the Union Army. This would deprive the Confederacy of a vital source of labor that was essential to its war effort. Third, the proclamation was designed to prevent foreign intervention in the war. Great Britain and France, which had been on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy, now backed away. They could not be seen to be supporting a slaveholding nation that was fighting to preserve the institution of human bondage. The Emancipation Proclamation, in effect, ended the threat of foreign intervention in the war. But the proclamation was also a deeply flawed document. It did not free a single slave in the areas where the Union government had authority, such as the border states of Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. It only applied to the areas that were in rebellion, areas where the Union government had no effective authority. This was a deliberate choice on Lincoln's part. He was afraid that if he freed the slaves in the border states, those states would secede and join the Confederacy. He could not afford to lose those states, so he exempted them from the proclamation. This meant that the Emancipation Proclamation was, in a very real sense, a hollow gesture. It did not immediately free a single slave. But it was a gesture that had profound symbolic and political significance. It was a promise that the Union was committed to ending slavery, a promise that would be fulfilled with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in December 1865. The reaction to the Emancipation Proclamation was mixed. In the North, it was greeted with enthusiasm by the abolitionists and with skepticism by many others. Some saw it as a bold and necessary step, a step that would give the war a moral purpose. Others saw it as a desperate and cynical move, a move that was designed to shore up Lincoln's political position. In the South, it was greeted with outrage and defiance. The Confederate government declared that Lincoln was inciting a slave rebellion, and they vowed to fight to the bitter end to preserve their way of life. In Europe, the proclamation was greeted with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. The British government, which had been on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy, now backed away. They could not be seen to be supporting a slaveholding nation, particularly in the wake of Lincoln's proclamation. The French government, which had been following the British lead, also backed away. The threat of foreign intervention in the war was over. For the soldiers of the Union Army, the Emancipation Proclamation was a source of both pride and confusion. Many of them had enlisted to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. They were fighting for their country, for their flag, for the memory of the Founding Fathers. The idea that they were now fighting to end slavery was a new and unsettling one. Some embraced it, seeing it as a noble and just cause. Others resented it, seeing it as a betrayal of the original purpose of the war. Still others were indifferent, caring only about surviving the war and getting home to their families. But whatever their individual feelings, the Emancipation Proclamation had changed the nature of the war. It was no longer just a war to preserve the Union. It was now a war to create a new Union, a Union without slavery, a Union that would be, in the words of Lincoln, the new birth of freedom. The Battle of Antietam also had profound strategic consequences. Lee's invasion of Maryland had been a bold and audacious gamble, a gamble that had failed. He had hoped to win a decisive victory on Northern soil, a victory that would demoralize the North, encourage the Peace Democrats, and convince the European powers to recognize the Confederacy. But he had been turned back, and his army had been badly mauled. The Army of Northern Virginia, which had seemed invincible just a few weeks before, was now a battered and exhausted force. It would take months for Lee to rebuild his army, months during which the Union would have the initiative. The failure of the Maryland campaign was a turning point in the war. It marked the end of the Confederacy's best chance for foreign intervention, and it gave the Union the political and strategic momentum it needed to continue the fight. For General George B. McClellan, the aftermath of Antietam was a time of frustration and recrimination. He had won a victory, but it was not the decisive victory that Lincoln had hoped for. He had failed to destroy Lee's army, and he had allowed the Confederate commander to escape back into Virginia. Lincoln, who had been growing increasingly frustrated with McClellan's caution and his reluctance to pursue the enemy, now lost patience. He visited McClellan at his headquarters in early October and urged him to pursue Lee and bring him to battle. But McClellan, true to his nature, hesitated. He complained that his army was exhausted, that his supplies were inadequate, that his horses were worn out. He would not move until he was certain of success. Lincoln, exasperated, returned to Washington and began to contemplate a change in command. On November 7, 1862, just 6 weeks after the battle, Lincoln relieved McClellan of his command. It was a decision that had been a long time coming, a decision that was driven by McClellan's repeated failures to pursue the enemy and bring the war to a decisive conclusion. McClellan, who had been adored by his soldiers, was devastated. He believed that he had been treated unfairly, that he had been the victim of political intrigue. He would spend the rest of his life defending his record and blaming others for his failures. But the truth was that McClellan had been given every opportunity to win the war, and he had failed. He was a brilliant organizer and a gifted administrator, but he lacked the killer instinct that was necessary to win on the battlefield. He was too cautious, too timid, too afraid of failure. And in the end, his caution had cost him his command and had prolonged the war. The Battle of Antietam was a turning point in the Civil War, a turning point that had profound and far-reaching consequences. It was a battle that was fought with savagery and courage that has rarely been equaled. It was a battle that left a deep and lasting scar on the American psyche. And it was a battle that changed the course of American history. The war would go on for another 2.5 years, and many more thousand would die before the final victory was won. But Antietam had changed the equation. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a war to create a new Union, a Union without slavery, a Union that would be, in the words of Lincoln, the new birth of freedom. The ghosts of Antietam had not died in vain. In the days and weeks following the battle, the fields of Antietam became a vast and terrible laboratory of human suffering. The medical corps of both armies, woefully unprepared for the scale of the carnage, struggled to cope with the thousands of wounded men who lay scattered across the landscape. The makeshift hospitals that had been set up in the farmhouses, barns, and churches of Sharpsburg were overwhelmed. The surgeons, their numbers inadequate and their supplies running low, worked with grim and tireless efficiency. They had no time for gentle bedside manners, no time for comforting words. They were engaged in a desperate race against time, a race to save as many lives as they could before infection, shock, and blood loss claimed their victims. The primary tool of the Civil War surgeon was the saw, and the sound of bone being severed was a constant and sickening counterpoint to the groans of the wounded. Amputation was the standard treatment for any serious wound to a limb. The surgeons believed, with some justification, that it was better to remove a shattered arm or leg than to risk the infection that would almost certainly follow if the limb was left intact. The problem was that amputation itself was a traumatic and often fatal procedure. Anesthesia, in the form of chloroform or ether, was available, but it was in short supply, and many men had to endure the agony of the saw without it. The mortality rate for amputations was high, somewhere between 25 and 30%, and those who survived were often left with crippling disabilities that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The conditions in the field hospitals were appalling. The floors were slick with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of chloroform, gangrene, and human waste. The wounded lay on the floor, on tables, on pews, anywhere there was space. They lay in their own filth, their wounds crawling with flies, their bodies racked with fever. The surgeons, their arms bare and their aprons stained with blood, moved from patient to patient, their faces grim and their eyes hollow. They worked by the light of candles and lanterns, their hands slippery with blood, their instruments crude and often unsterilized. They did the best they could with the knowledge and the tools they had, but it was not enough. For every man they saved, another died. The piles of amputated limbs outside the hospital doors grew higher with each passing day, a gruesome testament to the day's butchery. One of the surgeons who worked in the aftermath of Antietam was a young doctor named Jonathan Letterman. He was the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, and he had been appalled by the chaos and the inefficiency of the medical corps. In the wake of Antietam, he set about reforming the entire system. He established a system of ambulance corps, trained medical personnel who would be responsible for evacuating the wounded from the battlefield. He established a system of field hospitals, organized in a hierarchical structure, with the most seriously wounded being sent to the rear hospitals where they could receive more intensive care. He established a system of medical supplies, ensuring that the surgeons had the tools and the medicines they needed to do their work. Letterman's reforms would save countless lives in the battles to come, and he would be remembered as the father of modern battlefield medicine. But at Antietam, his reforms came too late. The wounded of Antietam would have to suffer through the old, inefficient system, a system that was as much a killer as the bullets and the shells. In the weeks following the battle, a new kind of visitor began to arrive at the fields of Antietam. They were not soldiers, and they were not doctors. They were photographers, men who had come to document the aftermath of the battle with their cameras. Photography was a relatively new technology in 1862, and it had never before been used to document the horrors of war. The most famous of these photographers was a man named Alexander Gardner. He was a Scottish immigrant who had worked for the famous photographer Matthew Brady, and he had come to Antietam with his assistant, James Gibson, to capture the grim reality of the battlefield. Gardner and Gibson arrived at Antietam on September 19, just 2 days after the battle. The dead still lay where they had fallen, their bodies bloating in the late summer heat. Gardner, a man of great artistic sensibility and a keen eye for composition, set about his work with a cold and clinical detachment. He photographed the dead in the cornfield, their bodies lying in rows as if on parade. He photographed the dead at the bloody lane, their bodies piled in grotesque heaps. He photographed the dead at Burnside's bridge, their bodies sprawled on the banks of the creek. He photographed the dead in the fields and in the woods, their faces frozen in the agony of their final moments. He photographed the living as well, the wounded who lay in the makeshift hospitals, their bodies shattered and their spirits broken. He photographed the surgeons at work, their saws and their knives, a grim counterpoint to the silence of the battlefield. Gardner's photographs of Antietam were a revelation. They were the first photographs to show the true horror of war, the grim reality that lay behind the romantic notions of glory and honor. When they were exhibited in Matthew Brady's gallery in New York City in October 1862, they caused a sensation. People lined up for hours to see them, and they were deeply affected by what they saw. The photographs brought the war home to the Northern public in a way that no newspaper account or painting ever could. They showed the true cost of war, the terrible price that was being paid for the preservation of the Union. A reporter for the New York Times, writing about the exhibition, said, "Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along the streets, he has done something very like it." Gardner's photographs of Antietam were a turning point in the history of photography and in the history of war. They showed that photography could be a powerful tool for documenting reality, for bearing witness to the truth. They also showed that war was not the romantic and glorious adventure that it was often portrayed to be. It was a brutal and savage affair, a contest of wills that was decided by which side could endure the most suffering. The photographs of Antietam were a stark and unflinching reminder of that truth, a reminder that would resonate through the ages. They were, in a very real sense, the first images of the ghosts of Antietam, the first visual record of the men who had fought and died there. And they would ensure that the memory of that terrible day would never be forgotten. For the soldiers who survived the Battle of Antietam, the experience would leave a mark that would never fade. They had seen things that no man should ever have to see, things that would haunt their dreams and their waking hours for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed the fragility of life, the ease with which a man could be transformed from a living, breathing being into a lifeless piece of meat. They had seen their friends and comrades, men they had shared a campfire with just the night before, cut down in an instant. They had seen men with their limbs blown off, their faces shot away, their bodies torn apart by the storm of iron. They had heard the screams of the wounded, the cries for water and for mothers and for God. They had smelled the stench of blood and gunpowder and death. And they had felt the cold, numbing terror that comes when a man realizes that he is standing on the edge of the abyss, that the next bullet or the next shell could be the one that ends his life. The psychological impact of the battle on the soldiers was profound and long-lasting. In the years following the war, many of them would suffer from what we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder. They would have nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety attacks. They would be unable to hold down jobs, unable to maintain relationships, unable to reintegrate into civilian society. They would turn to alcohol and drugs to numb the pain, and many of them would end their own lives. But in 1862, there was no understanding of the psychological wounds of war. The soldiers were expected to simply get over it, to put the war behind them and move on with their lives. Those who could not were seen as weak, as cowards, as men who lacked the moral fiber to endure the hardships of war. They were shunned by their communities and forgotten by their government. They were the invisible casualties of the war, the men who had been broken not by bullets and shells, but by the sheer horror of what they had witnessed. One of the soldiers who was deeply affected by the battle was a young private named William H. Andrews. He was a member of the 1st Georgia Regulars, and he had fought in the defense of the Bloody Lane. He had seen his regiment cut to pieces, and he had been one of the few who had survived. In the years following the war, he would write a memoir in which he described his experiences at Antietam. "I have seen many battles," he wrote, "but none that compared with Antietam. The fighting was so close, so savage, so utterly without mercy. We fought like demons, and we died like dogs. I saw men do things that day that I never thought human beings were capable of. I saw men kill with a cold and calculated fury. I saw men beg for their lives, and I saw their pleas ignored. I saw men die in agony, and I saw their bodies left to rot in the sun. And I saw something dying in myself that day, something that I have never been able to get back. I lost my innocence at Antietam, and I have been searching for it ever since. Another soldier who was deeply affected by the battle was a young captain named Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He was a member of the 20th Massachusetts, and he had been wounded 3 times during the war, including once at Antietam. He would go on to become one of the most distinguished jurists in American history, serving on the Supreme Court for over 30 years. But he would never forget the lessons he had learned on the battlefield. In his later years, he would often speak about the war, about the courage and the sacrifice of the men who had fought in it. But he would also speak about the futility of war, about the terrible cost that it exacted on the human spirit. War, he would say, is an organized bore. It was a statement that captured the profound disillusionment that many veterans felt about the war, a disillusionment that was born of the terrible experiences they had endured. The Battle of Antietam also had a profound impact on the families of the men who had fought there. For the families of the dead, the battle was a source of unending grief. They had lost sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers, men who would never come home, men whose bodies would lie in unmarked graves in a distant field. They would mourn their loss for the rest of their lives, and they would pass that grief on to their children and their grandchildren. The battle had robbed them of their loved ones, and it had left a hole in their lives that could never be filled. For the families of the wounded, the battle was a source of a different kind of grief. They had to watch as their loved ones struggled to recover from their wounds, as they endured the pain and the suffering of their injuries. They had to watch as men who had once been strong and healthy were reduced to shadows of their former selves, men who were crippled, disfigured, and broken. They had to care for them, to nurse them, to try to restore them to some semblance of their former lives. But for many, the wounds were too severe, the damage too great. They would never fully recover, and they would spend the rest of their lives as invalids, dependent on the charity of their families and their communities. The battle also had a profound impact on the communities from which the soldiers had come. In the small towns and villages of the North and the South, the casualty lists from Antietam were read with a sense of horror and disbelief. Entire regiments had been decimated, and entire communities had been plunged into mourning. The war, which had once seemed like a distant and abstract affair, was now a very real and immediate presence in their lives. The battle had brought the war home, and it had shown them the terrible price that was being paid for the preservation of the Union and for the defense of the Confederacy. In the years following the war, the veterans of Antietam would gather at reunions to remember the battle and to honor the memory of their fallen comrades. They would walk the fields where they had fought, and they would point out the places where they had stood, where their friends had fallen, where they had seen the face of death. They would tell stories of the battle, stories of courage and of cowardice, of heroism and of horror. And they would weep for the men who had not come home, for the men who had given their lives on that terrible day. These reunions were a way for the veterans to process their experiences, to make sense of the senseless, to find some meaning in the suffering they had endured. They were also a way for them to keep the memory of the battle alive, to ensure that the sacrifice of their comrades would not be forgotten. As the years passed, and the veterans of Antietam grew old and died, the memory of the battle began to fade. The fields where they had fought were returned to agriculture, and the scars of the battle were slowly erased by the plow. The farmhouses and barns that had been used as hospitals were torn down or renovated, and the blood that had stained their floors was washed away. The town of Sharpsburg, which had been at the epicenter of the battle, returned to its quiet and peaceful existence, a small farming community that was little different from any other in rural Maryland. But the ghosts of Antietam remained. They were in the whispers of the wind, in the rustle of the leaves, in the silent testimony of the monuments that dotted the landscape. They were the ghosts of the men who had fought and died there, the men who had given their lives for a cause they believed in. And they were a reminder of the terrible cost of war, a reminder that would echo through the ages. In the decades following the Civil War, as the nation struggled to heal the wounds of the conflict and to reunite the fractured Union, there was a growing movement to preserve the battlefields where the war had been fought. These battlefields were seen as sacred ground, places where the nation had been tested and where the ideals of freedom and democracy had been defended at a terrible cost. Antietam, as the site of the bloodiest day in American history, was at the forefront of this movement. In 1890, the Antietam National Cemetery was established, a final resting place for the Union soldiers who had fallen in the battle. The cemetery, with its rows of white headstones stretching as far as the eye could see, was a solemn and moving tribute to the men who had given their lives for the preservation of the Union. But the preservation of the battlefield itself was a more complicated matter. The land was privately owned, and the farmers who worked on it were not eager to give it up. It took years of lobbying and fundraising before the federal government finally agreed to establish Antietam National Battlefield in 1890. The battlefield was to be preserved as a memorial to the men who had fought there, a place where future generations could come to learn about the battle and to honor the memory of the fallen. Over the years, the battlefield has been carefully restored, with monuments and markers placed at key locations to help visitors understand the flow of the battle. The cornfield has been replanted, the sunken road has been preserved, and Burnside's bridge still stands, a silent witness to the terrible events of September 17, 1862. Today, Antietam National Battlefield is one of the most visited Civil War sites in the United States. Thousands of people come each year to walk to the fields where the battle was fought, to stand at the places where the soldiers stood, to try to understand what happened on that terrible day. They come to honor the memory of the men who fought and died there, to pay tribute to their courage and their sacrifice. They come to learn about the Civil War, about the issues that divided the nation, about the terrible cost of the conflict. And they come to reflect on the meaning of the battle, on what it says about the American experience, about the nature of war, about the enduring power of the human spirit. For many visitors, the experience of walking on the battlefield is a deeply moving and emotional one. To stand in the cornfield, to imagine the storm of lead that swept through it, to think of the thousands of men who fell there, is to be confronted with the stark and brutal reality of war. To stand at the bloody lane, to look down at the sunken road where the dead lay in heaps, to imagine the savage intensity of the fighting that took place there, is to be reminded of the terrible price that was paid for the preservation of the Union. To stand at Burnside's bridge, to imagine the Union soldiers charging across it under a hail of fire, to think of the men who fell into the creek and drowned, is to be humbled by the courage and the sacrifice of the men who fought there. But the battlefield is more than just a memorial to the dead. It is also a place of learning, a place where we can come to understand the complexities of the Civil War, the issues that divided the nation, the reasons why men were willing to fight and die for their beliefs. The Battle of Antietam was fought over many things: the preservation of the Union, the defense of the Confederacy, the question of slavery, the nature of freedom. It was a battle that reflected the deep and fundamental divisions that existed in American society, divisions that had been building for decades and that finally erupted into open warfare. To understand Antietam is to understand the Civil War, and to understand the Civil War is to understand America. The battle also raises profound questions about the nature of war itself. What drives men to kill each other with such savage intensity? What allows them to endure the terrible suffering of the battlefield? What gives them the courage to face death with such stoic determination? These are questions that have been asked by philosophers and historians for centuries, and they are questions that have no easy answers. But the Battle of Antietam, with its incredible scale of carnage and its profound impact on the course of American history, forces us to confront these questions in a very direct and immediate way. It forces us to think about the human capacity for violence, for cruelty, for self-sacrifice. It forces us to think about the nature of courage, of honor, of duty. And it forces us to think about the terrible cost of war, the price that is paid not just by the soldiers who fight it, but by the families and the communities that are left behind. The ghosts of Antietam are not just the ghosts of the men who fought and died there. They are also the ghosts of the ideals that they fought for, the ideals of freedom, of unity, of human dignity. These ideals were tested on the fields of Antietam, and they were found to be worth fighting for, worth dying for. The battle was a turning point in the Civil War, a turning point that led to the Emancipation Proclamation and ultimately to the end of slavery in the United States. It was a battle that helped to create a new union, a union that was more just, more equal, truer to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. The men who fought at Antietam did not die in vain. They died for a cause that was greater than themselves, a cause that would shape the future of the nation and the future of the world. But the battle also reminds us of the terrible cost of achieving those ideals. The 23,000 men who were killed, wounded, or went missing at Antietam were not abstract statistics. They were real people, with real lives, with real families, with real dreams and aspirations. They were farmers and shopkeepers, lawyers and laborers, men from all walks of life who had been brought together by the currents of history to fight and die on a quiet field in western Maryland. Their sacrifice was immense, and it should never be forgotten. The battlefield at Antietam is a place where we can come to remember them, to honor their memory, to ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain. As we walk in the fields of Antietam today, we are walking on hallowed ground. We are walking on ground that has been consecrated by the blood of thousands of men, men who gave their lives for a cause they believed in. We are walking on ground that has witnessed some of the most savage and brutal fighting in American history. And we are walking on ground that has shaped the course of American history, that has helped to create the nation that we are today. The ghosts of Antietam are all around us, in the whispers of the wind, in the rustle of the leaves, in the silent testimony of the monuments. They are the ghosts of the men who fought and died there, the ghosts of a nation that was forged in the crucible of war, the ghosts of the ideals that were tested and found to be worth fighting for. They are the ghosts that remind us of the terrible cost of war, and of the enduring power of the human spirit. To truly understand the Battle of Antietam, we must look beyond the grand strategies and the sweeping movements of armies. We must look at the individual stories, the personal experiences of the men who fought there. These are the stories that bring the battle to life, that transform it from a dry recitation of facts and figures into a living, breathing human drama. These are the stories of courage and cowardice, of heroism and horror, of sacrifice and survival. These are the stories of the ghosts of Antietam. Consider the story of Private John Marshall, a young soldier from Pennsylvania who fought in the Cornfield with the 28th Pennsylvania Infantry. He was just 19 years old, a farm boy who had enlisted with his friends from his hometown. He had never been in a battle before, and he was terrified. As his regiment advanced into the cornfield, he could hear the bullets whistling past his ears, could see the men around him falling. He wanted to run, wanted to throw down his rifle and flee from the horror. But he did not. He stayed with his regiment, he loaded and fired his rifle, he did his duty. And then, in the chaos of the battle, he was separated from his unit. He found himself alone in the cornfield, surrounded by the dead and the dying, with no idea where his regiment was or what he should do. He wandered through the corn, his rifle clutched in his hands, his heart pounding with fear. And then he saw a Confederate soldier, a young man about his own age, lying on the ground with a terrible wound to his stomach. The Confederate soldier looked up at him, his eyes pleading, and asked for water. John Marshall, despite everything he had been taught about the enemy, even though this man had been trying to kill him just moments before, could not refuse. He knelt beside the Confederate soldier, took out his canteen and gave him a drink. The two young men, enemies in war but brothers in suffering, looked at each other for a long moment. And then the Confederate soldier died, his hand still clutching John Marshall's arm. John Marshall would never forget that moment, would never forget the look in the dying man's eyes. It was a moment that taught him the true meaning of war, the terrible cost of the conflict. It was a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Consider the story of Captain William Thompson, a company commander in the 12th Massachusetts. He was a lawyer from Boston, a man of education and refinement, a man who had enlisted out of a sense of duty to his country. He had led his men into the cornfield with a calm and steady demeanor, his voice a beacon of reassurance in the chaos of battle. He had seen his colonel killed, had seen his major mortally wounded, had seen his regiment cut to pieces. But he had not wavered. He had rallied his men, had led them forward, had fought with a courage and a determination that had inspired all who saw him. And then, just as the regiment was about to fall back, he was hit. A Confederate bullet struck him in the chest, and he fell to the ground. His men gathered around him, their faces stricken with grief. He looked up at them, his face pale and his breathing labored, and said, "Tell my wife that I died doing my duty." And then he was gone. His men carried his body from the field, their hearts heavy with sorrow. Captain William Thompson was just one of the thousands who died at Antietam, but his story, like the stories of all the others, is a reminder of the terrible price that was paid on that day. Consider the story of Sergeant Thomas Galway, a member of the 8th Ohio Infantry who fought at Burnside's Bridge. He was an Irishman, a recent immigrant who had come to America in search of a better life. He had found work in a factory in Cleveland, and when the war broke out, he had enlisted with his fellow workers. He was a tough and hard-bitten soldier, a man who had seen his share of battles. But nothing had prepared him for the horror of Burnside's Bridge. As his regiment charged across the bridge, the Confederate fire was so intense that it seemed impossible that anyone could survive. Men fell all around him, their bodies tumbling into the creek below. But Thomas Galway kept going, his rifle in his hands, his eyes fixed on the far side of the bridge. He made it across, one of the few who did, and he fought his way up the hill on the other side. And then, just as the Union attack was beginning to gain momentum, he saw the Confederate reinforcements arrive. He saw the gray-clad soldiers of A.P. Hill's division slam into the Union flank, and he knew that the battle was lost. He fought his way back to the bridge, his regiment in full retreat, the Confederate soldiers hot on their heels. He made it back across the bridge, but he was one of the last. He collapsed on the far side, his body exhausted, his spirit broken. He had survived the battle, but he would never be the same. The experience had changed him, had taken something from him that he would never get back. He would spend the rest of his life trying to forget what he had seen at Burnside's Bridge, but the memories would never leave him. Consider the story of Colonel John Brown Gordon, a Confederate officer who fought at the Bloody Lane. He was a lawyer from Georgia, a man of great intelligence and charisma, a man who would go on to become one of the most distinguished Confederate generals of the war. But at Antietam, he was just a colonel, leading his regiment in the defense of the sunken road. He fought with fierce and determined courage, his voice a constant presence in the chaos of battle. He rallied his men, he led them forward, he inspired them to hold their ground against overwhelming odds. And then he was hit. A Union bullet struck him in the face, shattering his jaw and knocking him to the ground. He lay there, bleeding and in terrible pain, but he refused to leave the field. He continued to give orders, his words garbled but his meaning clear. And then he was hit again, this time in the shoulder. And then again, in the leg. And then again, in the arm. He was hit 5 times in all, each wound more serious than the last. Finally, as he lay on the ground, his body riddled with bullets, he was hit one more time, this time in the head. The bullet struck him in the temple and exited through his cheek, and he fell unconscious. His men, thinking he was dead, carried him from the field. But John Brown Gordon was not dead. He would survive his wounds, though it would take months of painful recovery. He would go on to fight in many more battles, and he would become one of the most celebrated Confederate generals of the war. But he would never forget Antietam, would never forget the day he was shot 5 times and left for dead on the Bloody Lane. These are just a few of the thousands of individual stories from the Battle of Antietam. Each man who fought there had his own story, his own experience, his own memories of that terrible day. Some were stories of heroism, of men who rose to the occasion and performed acts of incredible courage. Some were stories of tragedy, of men who were cut down in the prime of their lives, their dreams and aspirations snuffed out in an instant. Some were stories of survival, of men who endured the horror of the battle and lived to tell the tale. But all of them, every single one, were stories of human beings caught up in the maelstrom of war, human beings who were forced to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, human beings who were tested in ways that most of us can never imagine. The individual stories from Antietam also reveal the complex and often contradictory nature of the Civil War. It was a war that pitted brother against brother, friend against friend, neighbor against neighbor. It was a war that was fought over fundamental questions about the nature of the Union, the rights of the states, and the institution of slavery. But it was also a war that was fought by ordinary men, men who were motivated by a complex mix of patriotism, duty, honor, and self-preservation. Some fought because they believed in the cause, whether that cause was the preservation of the Union or the defense of the Confederacy. Some fought because they felt it was their duty to their country, to their state, to their community. Some fought because they were caught up in the excitement and the romance of war, because they wanted to prove their manhood, because they wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. And some fought simply because they had no choice, because they had been drafted or because they felt the social pressure to enlist. But whatever their motivations, whatever their beliefs, the men who fought at Antietam were united by a common experience. They had all faced death, they had all witnessed the horror of war, they had all been tested in the crucible of battle. And they had all been changed by the experience. Some were ennobled by it, some were broken by it, and some were simply left with a profound sense of the futility and the waste of war. But all of them, every single one, carried the memory of Antietam with them for the rest of their lives. It was a memory that would shape their understanding of themselves, of their country, of the nature of human existence. It was a memory that would make them part of the ghosts of Antietam, the ghosts that would haunt the American psyche for generations to come. To fully appreciate the significance of the Battle of Antietam, we must place it in the broader context of the American Civil War. The war was not just a military conflict. It was a profound and fundamental struggle over the very nature of the American experiment. It was a struggle over whether the United States would remain a single, unified nation or would fracture into two or more separate countries. It was a struggle over the balance of power between the federal government and the states. And, most fundamentally, it was a struggle over the institution of slavery, an institution that had been a part of American life since the founding of the colonies, an institution that had become so deeply embedded in the economic and social fabric of the South that many Southerners believed they could not survive without it. The roots of the Civil War can be traced back to the very founding of the nation. The Constitution, that great document that established the framework of American government, was a compromise between the slaveholding states of the South and the free states of the North. The Southern states, which were economically dependent on slave labor, insisted that slavery be protected and that they be allowed to maintain their peculiar institution. The Northern states, many of which had already abolished slavery or were in the process of doing so, were uncomfortable with the institution but were willing to tolerate it to achieve the goal of a unified nation. The result was a constitution that was deliberately ambiguous on the question of slavery, a constitution that protected the institution in some ways while leaving open the possibility of its eventual abolition. For the first few decades of the nation's existence, this compromise was held. The issue of slavery was a source of tension, but it was not a source of open conflict. But as the nation expanded westward, as new territories were acquired and new states were admitted to the Union, the question of whether those new states would be slave or free became increasingly contentious. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 were all attempts to manage this tension, to find a way to balance the interests of the slave states and the free states. But each of these compromises only postponed the inevitable reckoning. The issue of slavery was too fundamental, too deeply rooted in the economic and social structures of the two regions, to be resolved by political compromise. By the 1850s, the nation was deeply divided. The South, feeling increasingly threatened by the growing political and economic power of the North, began to talk openly of secession. The North, increasingly influenced by the abolitionist movement, began to see slavery not just as a political issue but as a moral evil that had to be eradicated. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, on a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery into the new territories, was the final straw for the South. 7 Southern states seceded from the Union even before Lincoln took office, and 4 more would follow after the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861. The Civil War had begun. The war was, from the beginning, a struggle of epic proportions. The Confederacy, though outnumbered and outgunned, was fighting on its own territory, with shorter supply lines and a population that was deeply committed to the cause of independence. The Union, though it had superior resources and a larger population, was fighting an offensive war, trying to conquer and occupy a vast territory. The early years of the war went badly for the Union. The Confederate armies, led by brilliant generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, won a series of stunning victories. The Union armies, led by a succession of incompetent or overly cautious generals, suffered a series of humiliating defeats. By the summer of 1862, the Union cause seemed to be in jeopardy. The North was war-weary, the peace Democrats were gaining strength, and there was a real possibility that the Confederacy would win its independence. It was in this context that the Battle of Antietam took place. Lee's invasion of Maryland was a bold attempt to capitalize on the Union's weakness, to win a decisive victory on Northern soil that would demoralize the North, encourage the peace Democrats, and convince the European powers to recognize the Confederacy. If Lee had succeeded, if he had won a crushing victory at Antietam, the course of the war, and the course of American history, might have been very different. The North might have sued for peace, the Confederacy might have won its independence, and the institution of slavery might have endured for decades or even centuries longer. But Lee failed. He was turned back at Antietam, and his army was forced to retreat to Virginia. The Union had won a victory, albeit a costly and imperfect one. And that victory gave Abraham Lincoln the political capital he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that would transform the war from a struggle to preserve the Union into a revolutionary war for freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point in the war, but it was not the end of the war. The fighting would go on for another 2.5 years, and many more thousands would die before the final victory was won. But Antietam had changed the equation. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a war to end slavery, a war to create a new Union, a Union that would be more just, more equal, truer to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. The men who fought at Antietam, both Union and Confederate, did not fully understand the significance of what they were doing. They were fighting for their immediate goals, the preservation of the Union, the defense of the Confederacy, the survival of their regiments, the safety of their comrades. But in doing so, they were also fighting for something larger, something that would shape the future of the nation and the future of the world. The legacy of Antietam is a complex and multifaceted one. On the one hand, it was a battle that was fought with incredible courage and savage brutality, a battle that left a deep and lasting scar on the American psyche. On the other hand, it was a battle that had profound and far-reaching consequences, consequences that helped to shape the nation that we are today. It was a battle that led to the Emancipation Proclamation, which in turn led to the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery in the United States. It was a battle that helped to preserve the Union, to keep the nation from fracturing into 2 or more separate countries. It was a battle that demonstrated the terrible cost of war, the price that is paid not just by the soldiers who fight it, but by the families and the communities that are left behind. But perhaps most importantly, Antietam was a battle that tested the ideals upon which the nation was founded. The Declaration of Independence had proclaimed that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But for the first 85 years of the nation's existence, those ideals had been honored more in the breach than in the observance. Millions of African Americans were held in bondage, denied their basic human rights, treated as property rather than as human beings. The Civil War, and the Battle of Antietam in particular, was a test of whether the nation was truly committed to those ideals, whether it was willing to pay the terrible price necessary to make them reality. The answer, forged in the crucible of war, was yes. The nation was willing to pay that price. And in doing so, it took a giant step toward becoming the more perfect union that the Founding Fathers had envisioned. The Battle of Antietam was not just a test of courage and endurance. It was also a test of military tactics and strategy, a test of the ability of the commanders on both sides to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. The Civil War was fought at a time of rapid technological change, a time when new weapons and new tactics were transforming the battlefield. The rifled musket, which had replaced the smoothbore musket as the standard infantry weapon, was far more accurate and had a much longer range than its predecessor. This meant that infantry formations could deliver devastating fire at distances of up to 400 yards, making the traditional frontal assault, which had been the standard tactic of Napoleonic warfare, a suicidal proposition. The commanders on both sides at Antietam were still learning how to adapt to this new reality, and the result was a battle that was characterized by a series of frontal assaults that resulted in horrific casualties. The rifled musket was not the only technological innovation that shaped the Battle of Antietam. Artillery, too, has undergone significant improvements. The new rifled cannons were more accurate and had a longer range than the old smoothbore cannons, and they could fire a variety of projectiles, including solid shots, explosive shells, and canisters. Canister, which consisted of a tin can filled with iron balls that would scatter like a giant shotgun blast when fired, was particularly deadly at close range. The artillery at Antietam played a crucial role in the battle, providing covering fire for the infantry assaults and breaking up Confederate counterattacks. But the artillery also contributed to the horrific casualty figures, as the explosive shells and the canister rounds tore through the ranks of the attacking infantry. The tactics employed by the commanders at Antietam were, for the most part, the tactics of the Napoleonic era, tactics that had been developed for the smoothbore musket and that were ill-suited to the rifled musket. The standard tactic was the frontal assault, in which a line of infantry would advance towards the enemy position, firing as they went, with the goal of breaking the enemy line and forcing them to retreat. The problem was that the increased range and accuracy of the rifled musket meant that the attacking infantry would be subjected to devastating fire long before they could close with the enemy. The result was that the frontal assaults at Antietam, whether they were Union assaults on Confederate positions or Confederate counterattacks on Union positions, were almost invariably repulsed with heavy casualties. General George B. McClellan's plan for the battle was a sound one in theory. He intended to launch a series of coordinated attacks on different parts of the Confederate line, with the goal of stretching Lee's forces thin and breaking through at a weak point. But in practice, the plan fell apart. McClellan failed to coordinate the attacks, and they were launched piecemeal, one after another, rather than simultaneously. This allowed Lee to shift his forces from one part of the line to another, reinforcing the threatened sectors and repulsing the Union assaults. The result was that the Union attacks, though they inflicted heavy casualties on the Confederates, failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. McClellan also failed to commit his reserves at the critical moment. He had two entire corps, the 5th and the 6th, that were held in reserve and that were never engaged in the battle. If he had committed these fresh troops at the moment when the Confederate center was shattered after the fall of the Bloody Lane, he might have been able to break through and destroy Lee's army. But he did not. He was paralyzed by his fear of a Confederate counterattack, by his belief that Lee had a vast, hidden reserve that was waiting to strike. And so, the opportunity was lost. General Robert E. Lee's tactics at Antietam were, in many ways, a masterpiece of defensive warfare. He was outnumbered nearly 2-1, and he was fighting with his back to the Potomac River, with only a single ford to serve as an escape route. But he used the terrain to his advantage, positioning his forces on the high ground and using the natural features of the landscape, such as the sunken road and the woods along the Hagerstown Turnpike, to provide cover and concealment for his troops. He also demonstrated a remarkable ability to shift his forces from one part of the line to another, reinforcing the threatened sectors and repulsing the Union assaults. Lee's greatest strength as a commander was his ability to read the battlefield, to anticipate his opponent's moves, and to react quickly and decisively. At Antietam, he demonstrated all of these qualities. He was able to hold off a vastly superior Union force for an entire day, inflicting heavy casualties and preventing a decisive breakthrough. But he also made mistakes. His decision to stand and fight Antietam, rather than retreating into Virginia, was a risky one. If McClellan had been a more aggressive commander, if he had committed his reserves at the critical moment, Lee's army might have been destroyed. But McClellan was not an aggressive commander, and Lee's gamble paid off. He was able to hold his ground for a day and then retreat into Virginia under the cover of darkness. The Battle of Antietam also highlighted the importance of leadership at all levels of command. The performance of the individual regiments and brigades was often determined by the quality of their officers. A good officer, a man who was brave, decisive, and able to inspire his men, could make all the difference in the chaos of battle. A bad officer, a man who was cowardly, indecisive, or incompetent, could doom his men to defeat and death. At Antietam, there were examples of both. There were officers like Colonel Fletcher Webster of the 12th Massachusetts, who led his men into the cornfield with a calm and steady demeanor and who was killed at the head of his regiment. There were officers like General John Brown Gordon, who were shot 5 times but refused to leave the field. There were officers like General Thomas Francis Meagher, who led the Irish Brigade with a fiery passion and a deep understanding of his men. But there were also officers who failed, who panicked under fire, who made mistakes that cost the lives of their men. The quality of leadership at Antietam, as in all battles, was a critical factor in determining the outcome. The soldiers who fought at Antietam were, for the most part, volunteers. They were not professional soldiers. They were farmers and shopkeepers, lawyers and laborers, men who had enlisted out of a sense of patriotism, duty, or adventure. They had received only a few months of training before being thrown into battle, and many of them had never fired a shot in anger before. But they fought with courage and determination that was remarkable. They stood in the open fields and traded volleys with the enemy, they charged across bridges under a hail of fire, they fought hand-to-hand in the cornfield and the bloody lane. They did things that most of us can never imagine doing, things that required a level of courage and self-sacrifice that is almost incomprehensible. And they did it not because they were superhuman, but because they were ordinary men who were called upon to do extraordinary things. They were the citizen soldiers of the Republic, the men who had answered the call to defend their country, to preserve the Union, to fight for the ideals of freedom and democracy. And they paid a terrible price for their service. The nature of Civil War combat was such that the soldiers were subjected to a level of violence and trauma that is difficult for us to comprehend today. They fought at close quarters, often within a few dozen yards of the enemy. They could see the faces of the men they were shooting at, could hear their screams when they were hit. They were subjected to a constant barrage of rifle fire, artillery shells, and canister rounds. The air was thick with the smoke of battle, making it difficult to see and to breathe. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of gunfire and explosions that made it impossible to hear orders or to communicate with their comrades. The smell was nauseating, a mixture of gunpowder, blood, and human waste. And the fear was overwhelming, a constant, gnawing terror that they would be the next to fall, that they would be killed or maimed, that they would never see their families again. To endure this level of violence and trauma requires a level of mental and physical toughness that is almost unimaginable. And yet, the soldiers at Antietam endured it. They stood their ground, they did their duty, they fought until they could fight no more. They were the ghosts of Antietam, the men who had been tested in the crucible of war and who had not been found wanting. The Battle of Antietam stands as a watershed moment not just in the American Civil War, but in the broader sweep of human history. It was a battle that demonstrated the terrible cost of war, the price that is paid when nations and peoples resort to violence to resolve their differences. It was a battle that showed the incredible capacity of human beings for both cruelty and compassion, for both destruction and creation. It was a battle that tested the ideals upon which the American nation was founded, and it was a battle that, in the end, helped to move the nation closer to those ideals. In the years and decades following the war, the veterans of Antietam would struggle to make sense of what they had experienced. They would gather at reunions, they would tell their stories, they would try to explain to those who what it had not been there had been like. But the truth was that there were no words that could adequately capture the horror of that day, no way to convey to those who had not experienced it the sheer intensity of violence, the overwhelming sense of fear and confusion, the profound sadness that came with the loss of so many comrades. The Battle of Antietam was, in many ways, beyond words, beyond comprehension. It was an experience that could only be understood by those who had lived through it, and even they struggled to make sense of it. But if the veterans could not fully explain what they had experienced, they could at least bear witness to it. They could ensure that the memory of the battle, and the memory of the men who had fought and died there, would not be forgotten. They could tell their stories, they could preserve the battlefield, they could erect monuments to honor the fallen. And they could pass on to future generations the lessons that they had learned, the hard-won wisdom that had been forged in the crucible of war. They could teach us about the terrible cost of conflict, about the importance of preserving peace, about the need to resolve our differences through dialogue and compromise rather than through violence. They could teach us about the importance of courage, of duty, of sacrifice. And they could teach us about the enduring power of the human spirit, the ability of ordinary men and women to rise to the occasion, to do extraordinary things, to endure the unendurable. The ghosts of Antietam are not just the ghosts of the past. They are also the ghosts of the present and the future. They are the ghosts that remind us of the terrible cost of war, of the price that is paid when we fail to resolve our differences peacefully. They are the ghosts that remind us of the importance of preserving the Union, of maintaining the bonds that hold us together as a nation. They are the ghosts that remind us of the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality, a struggle that did not end with the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment, but that continues to this day. They are the ghosts that remind us of our shared humanity, of the fact that we are all, in the end, brothers and sisters, that we all share the same hopes and dreams, the same fears and anxieties, the same capacity for love and for hate. As we stand on the fields of Antietam today, as we walk to the ground where the battle was fought, as we look at the monuments and the markers that the landscape, we are reminded of all of these things. We are reminded of the terrible cost of war, of the sacrifice of the men who fought and died there. We are reminded of the ideals for which they fought, the ideals of freedom, of unity, of human dignity. We are reminded of the ongoing struggle to make those ideals a reality, to create a nation that is truly just, truly equal, truly free. And we are reminded of our own responsibility, our own duty to carry on that struggle, to honor the memory of those who have gone before us by working to create a better world, a world in which the terrible lessons of Antietam are never forgotten, a world in which the ghosts of Antietam can finally rest in peace. The story of Antietam is not just a story of death and destruction. It is also a story of hope and redemption. It is a story of a nation that was torn apart by its own internal contradictions, but that ultimately found the strength and the courage to heal itself. It is a story of men who were willing to sacrifice everything for a cause they believed in, men who gave their lives so that others might be free. It is a story of the enduring power of the human spirit, the ability of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, to create a better future for themselves and for their children. The Battle of Antietam was fought on September 17, 1862, but its echoes continue to reverberate through the ages. It was a battle that changed the course of American history, that helped to shape the nation that we are today. It was a battle that demonstrated the terrible cost of war, but also the incredible capacity of human beings for courage, for sacrifice, for compassion. It was a battle that tested the ideals upon which the nation was found, and that ultimately helped to move the nation closer to those ideals. It was a battle that left a deep and lasting scar on the American psyche, but that also gave birth to a new and more just union, a union that was committed to the principles of freedom and equality for all. The ghosts of Antietam are all around us. They are in the fields where the corn still grows, in the woods where the trees still stand, in the creek that still flows under the stone bridge. They are in the monuments and the markers that, the landscape, silent witnesses to the terrible events of that day. They are in the stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, stories of courage and sacrifice, of heroism and horror. They are in the collective memory of the nation, a memory that is both painful and proud, a memory that reminds us of who we are and where we have come from. They are the ghosts of the men who fought and died there, the ghosts of a nation that was forged in the crucible of war, the ghosts of the ideals that were tested and found to be worth fighting for. And they are ghosts that call out to us over the years, ghosts that remind us of our responsibilities, of our duties, of our obligations to the past and to the future. They remind us that freedom is not free, that it must be defended and preserved by each generation. They remind us that the Union is not guaranteed, that it must be nurtured and strengthened by the bonds of mutual respect and common purpose. They remind us that the struggle for equality and justice is not over, that it continues to this day, and that we all have a role to play in that struggle. They remind us that we are the inheritors of a great noble tradition, a tradition of courage and sacrifice, of duty and honor, of freedom and democracy. And they remind us that we have a responsibility to pass that tradition on to future generations, to ensure that the sacrifices of those who have gone before us were not in vain. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest day in American history. 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing in the space of 12 hours. It was a day of unimaginable horror, a day of savage violence, a day that left a deep and lasting scar on the nation. But it was also a day that changed the course of history, a day that led to the Emancipation Proclamation and ultimately to the end of slavery in the United States. It was a day that tested the ideals upon which the nation was found, and a day that ultimately helped to move the nation closer to those ideals. It was a day that demonstrated the terrible cost of war, but also the incredible capacity of human beings for courage, for sacrifice, for compassion. It was a day that gave birth to the ghosts of Antietam, ghosts that continue to haunt us, to inspire us, to remind us of who we are and what we stand for. We can almost see them, the men in blue and gray, marching across the fields, their rifles on their shoulders, their faces grim and determined. We can almost hear the drums, the rattle of the musketry, the thunder of the guns. We can almost smell the smoke of battle, the scent of gunpowder and blood. And we can almost feel the presence of those who fought and died there, the presence of the men who gave their lives for a cause they believed in, the men who sacrificed everything so that we might be free. The ghosts of Antietam are not to be feared. They are to be honored, to be remembered, to be cherished. They are the ghosts of our ancestors, the ghosts of the men who fought and died to preserve the Union and to end slavery. They are the ghosts of the ideals upon which our nation was founded, the ideals of freedom, of equality, of human dignity. They are the ghosts that remind us of our responsibilities, of our duties, of our obligations to the past and to the future. They are the ghosts that call out to us across the years, urging us to be worthy of their sacrifice, urging us to carry on the struggle for freedom and justice, urging us to create a nation that is truly just, truly equal, truly free. The story of Antietam is a story that must never be forgotten. It is a story that must be told and retold, passed down from generation to generation, so that the sacrifices of those who fought and died there will never be in vain. It is a story that reminds us of the terrible cost of war, of the price that is paid when we fail to resolve our differences peacefully. It is a story that reminds us of the importance of preserving the Union, of maintaining the bonds that hold us together as a nation. It is a story that reminds us of the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality, a struggle that continues to this day. And it is a story that reminds us of the enduring power of the human spirit, the ability of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, to create a better future for themselves and for their children. If this story has awakened something in you, if it has resonated with the truth in your own heart, then our journey together has just begun. Subscribe to this channel. In the quiet moments, when we stand alone on the fields of Antietam, when the crowds have gone and the only sound is the whisper of the wind through the trees, we can feel the weight of history pressing down upon us. We can feel the presence of the thousands of men who fought and died there, the men whose blood soaked into the soil, whose bones lie buried beneath the ground. We can feel the magnitude of what happened on that terrible day, the profound significance of the battle, the way it changed the course of American history and shaped the nation that we are today. The Battle of Antietam was not just a military engagement. It was a moral reckoning, a moment when the nation was forced to confront the fundamental contradictions at the heart of the American experiment. How could a nation that proclaimed that all men are created equal continue to hold millions of people in bondage? How could a nation that was founded on the principles of liberty and justice tolerate an institution as brutal and dehumanizing as slavery? These were questions that had been asked for decades, questions that had been debated in Congress and in the courts, questions that had divided families and communities. But at Antietam, these questions were no longer abstract philosophical debates. They were matters of life and death, matters that were being decided on the battlefield, in the crucible of war. The men who fought at Antietam did not have the luxury of philosophical reflection. They were too busy trying to survive, too busy loading and firing their rifles, too busy dodging bullets and shells, too busy watching their comrades fall around them. But in their actions, in their willingness to fight and die for their beliefs, they were answering those fundamental questions. The Union soldiers were fighting to preserve the Union, to keep the nation from fracturing into two or more separate countries. But they were also fighting, whether they fully realized it or not, to end slavery, to create a new Union that would be more just, more equal, truer to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. The Confederate soldiers were fighting to defend their homes, their families, their way of life. But they were also fighting, whether they fully realized it or not, to preserve an institution that was fundamentally incompatible with the ideals of freedom and human dignity. The tragedy of the Civil War, and of the Battle of Antietam in particular, is that so many men had to die before these questions could be answered. The tragedy is that it took a war of unparalleled savagery and brutality to finally resolve the issue of slavery, an issue that should have been resolved peacefully, through dialogue and compromise. The tragedy is that the nation had to be torn apart, that families had to be divided, that communities had to be destroyed, before the nation could be reunited and rebuilt on a more just foundation. The tragedy is that 23,000 men had to be killed, wounded, or go missing in a single day before the nation could begin to move forward, to begin to heal the wounds of the conflict, to begin to create a new and better Union. But if the Battle of Antietam was a tragedy, it was also a triumph. It was a triumph of the human spirit, a demonstration of the incredible capacity of ordinary people to endure extraordinary suffering, to face death with courage and dignity, to sacrifice everything for a cause they believed in. It was a triumph of the ideals upon which the nation was founded, a demonstration that those ideals were worth fighting for, worth dying for. It was a triumph of the Union, a demonstration that the nation could survive even the most terrible of trials, that it could emerge from the crucible of war stronger and more united than before. And it was a triumph of freedom, a demonstration that the arc of history, though it may be long and tortuous, ultimately bends towards justice. The legacy of Antietam is a living legacy, a legacy that continues to shape our nation and our world. The battle led directly to the Emancipation Proclamation, which in turn led to the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery in the United States. It helped to preserve the Union, to keep the nation from fracturing into two or more separate countries. It demonstrated the terrible cost of war, the price that is paid when we fail to resolve our differences peacefully. And it showed the world that the United States was committed to the principles of freedom and equality, that it was willing to pay the ultimate price to defend those principles. But the legacy of Antietam is not just about the past. It is also about the present and the future. It is about the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality, a struggle that did not end with the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment, but that continues to this day. It is about the importance of preserving the Union, of maintaining the bonds that hold us together as a nation, of finding ways to bridge our differences and to work together for the common good. It is about the need to remember the terrible cost of war, to honor the sacrifice of those who have fought and died for our freedom, and to work tirelessly to prevent such conflicts from happening again. And it is about the enduring power of the human spirit, the ability of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, to create a better future for themselves and for their children. The ghosts of Antietam are with us still. They are in the stories we tell, in the monuments we erect, in the battlefields we preserve. They are in the collective memory of the nation, a memory that is both painful and proud, a memory that reminds us of who we are and where we have come from. They are in the ideals we cherish, the ideals of freedom, of equality, of human dignity. And they are in the responsibilities we bear, the responsibilities to honor the sacrifice of those who have gone before us, to carry on the struggle for a more just and equal society, to ensure that the terrible lessons of Antietam are never forgotten. As we conclude this journey through the bloodiest day in American history, as we reflect on the terrible events of September 17, 1862, we are left with a profound sense of both sorrow and hope. Sorrow for the thousands of men who lost their lives on that day, for the families who mourned them, for the communities that were forever changed by their loss. But also hope, hope that their sacrifice was not in vain, hope that the nation they fought to preserve and to transform has become a better, more just, more equal place. Hope that we, the inheritors of their legacy, will be worthy of their sacrifice, that we will carry on the struggle for freedom and justice, that we will work to create a nation that truly lives up to the ideals for which they fought and died. The ghosts of Antietam call out to us across the years. They call out to us to remember, to honor, to learn. They call out to us to be worthy of their sacrifice, to carry on their struggle, to create a better world. They call out to us to never forget the terrible cost of war, the price that is paid when we fail to resolve our differences peacefully. They call out to us to preserve the Union, to maintain the bonds that hold us together as a nation. They call out to us to continue the fight for freedom and equality, a fight that is never truly over, a fight that each generation must take up anew. And they call out to us to remember that we are all, in the end, brothers and sisters, that we all share the same hopes and dreams, the same capacity for love and for sacrifice, the same responsibility to create a better future for ourselves and for our children. If this story has awakened something in you, if it has resonated with the truth in your own heart, then our journey together has just begun. Subscribe to this channel.